A Broken Looking Glass by Henry Harland. He climbed the 3 flights of stone stairs and put his key into the lock. But before he turned it, he stopped, to rest, to take breath. On the door, his name was painted in big white letters, Mr. Richard Dane. It is always silent in the temple at midnight. Tonight, the silence was dense, like a fog. It was Sunday night, and on Sunday night, even within the hushed precincts of the temple, one is conscious of a deeper hush. When he had lighted the lamp in his sitting room, he let himself drop into an armchair before the empty fireplace. He was tired. He was exhausted. Yet nothing had happened to tire him. He had dined, as he always dined on Sundays, with the Rodericks in Chain Walk. He had driven home in a hansom. There was no reason why he should be tired. But he was tired. A deadly lassitude penetrated his body and his spirit like a fluid. He was too tired to go to bed. I suppose I'm getting old, he thought. To the second person, the matter would have appeared not one of supposition, but of certainty. Not of progression, but of accomplishment. Getting old indeed, but he was old. It was an old man, gray and wrinkled and wasted, who sat there, limp, sunken upon himself in his easy chair. In years, to be sure, he was under 60, but he looked like a man of 75. I am getting old, I suppose. I am getting old. And vaguely, dully, he contemplated his life, spread out behind him like a misty landscape, and thought what a failure it had been. What had it come to? What had it brought him? What had he done or won? Nothing. Nothing. It had brought him nothing but old age, solitude, disappointment, and tonight especially, a sense of fatigue and apathy that weighed upon him like a suffocating blanket. On a table, a yard or two away, stood a decanter of whiskey, with some soda water bottles and tumblers. He looked at it with heavy eyes, and he knew that there was what he needed. A little whiskey would straighten him, revive him, and make it possible for him to bestir himself and undress and go to bed. But when he thought of rising and moving to pour the whiskey out, he shrank from that effort as from an Herculean labor. No, he was too tired. Then his mind went back to the friends he had left in Chelsea half an hour ago. It seemed an indefinitely long time ago, years and years ago. They were like blurred phantoms, dimly remembered from a remote past. Yet, his life has been a failure, total, miserable, abject. It had come down to nothing. Its harvest was a harvest of ashes. It had been a useful life. He could have accepted its unhappiness. If it had been a happy life, he could have forgotten its uselessness, but it had been both useless and unhappy. He had done nothing for others. He had won nothing for himself. Oh, but he had tried. When he had left Oxford, people expected great things of him. He had expected great things of himself. He was admitted to be clever, to be gifted. He was ambitious. He was in earnest. He wished to make a name. He wished to justify his existence by fruitful work. And he had worked hard. He had put all his knowledge, all his talent, all his energy into his work. He had not spared himself. He had passed laborious days and studious nights. And what remained to show for it? 3 or 4 volumes upon political economy that had been read in their day a little, discussed a little, and then quite forgotten, superseded by the books of newer men. Pulped, he reflected bitterly. Except for a stray dozen of copies scattered here and there in the British Museum, in his college library, on his own bookshelves, his published writings had, by this time he could not doubt, met with the common fate of unappreciated literature and been pulped. That hateful word beat rhythmically again and again in his tired brain. And for a little while, that was all he was conscious of. So much for the work of his life. And for the rest, the play, the living, he had nothing to recall but failure. It had sufficed that he should desire a thing for him to miss it, that he should set his heart upon a thing, for it to be removed beyond the sphere of his possible acquisition. It had been so from the beginning. It had been so always. He sat motionless as a stone, and allowed his thoughts to drift listlessly hither and thither in the current of memory. Everywhere they encountered wreckage, derelicts, defeated aspirations, broken hopes. Languidly, he envisaged these. He was too tired to resent, to rebel. He even found a certain sluggish satisfaction in recognizing with what unvarying harshness destiny had treated him, in resigning himself to the unmerited. He caught sight of his hand, lying flat and inert upon the brown leather of his arm of chair. His eyes rested on it, and for the moment forgot everything else in a sort of torpid study of it. How white was, how thin, how withered. The nails were parched into minute corrugations. The veins stood out like dark wires. The skin hung loosely on it and had a dry luster. An old man's hand. He gazed at it fixedly till his eyes closed and his head fell forward. But he was not sleepy. He was only tired and weak. He raised his head with a start and changed his position. He felt cold, but to endure the cold was easier than to get up and put something on or go to bed. How silent the world was, how empty his room. An immense feeling of solitude, of isolation fell upon him. He was quite cut off from the rest of humanity here. If anything should happen to him, if he should need help of any sort, what could he do? Call out? But who would hear? At 9 a.m, the porter's wife would come in with his tea. But if anything should happen to him in the meantime, there would be nothing for it but to wait till 9 o'clock. Ah, if he had married, if he had children, a wife, a home of his own, instead of these desolate bachelor chambers. If he had married indeed, it was his sorrow's crown of sorrow that he had not married, that he had not been able to marry, that the girl he had wished to marry wouldn't have him. Failure, success. He could have accounted failure in other things a trifle. He could have laughed at what the world calls failure if Eleanor Lynde had been his wife. But that was the heart of his misfortune. She wouldn't have him. He had met her for the first time when he was a lad of 20 and she a girl of 18. He could see her palpable before him now, her slender girlish figure, her bright eyes, her laughing mouth, her warm brown hair curling round her forehead. Oh, how he had loved her. For 12 years he had waited upon her, wooed her, hoped to win her. But she had always said, "No, I don't love you. I am very fond of you. I love you as a friend. We all love you that way. My mother, my father, my sisters. But I can't marry you." However, she married no one else. She loved no one else. And for 12 years, he was an ever welcome guest in her father's house. And she would talk with him, play to him, pity him, and he could hope. Then she died. He called one day and they said she was ill. After that, there came a blank in his memory, a gulf full of blackness and redness, anguish and confusion, and then a sort of dreadful sudden calm when they told him she was dead. He remembered standing in her room after the funeral with her father, her mother, her sister Elizabeth. He remembered the pale play light that filled it, and how orderly and cold and forsaken it all spoke. And there was her bed, the bed she had died in, and there her dressing table with her combs and brushes, and there her writing desk, her bookcase. He remembered a row of medicine bottles on the mantelpiece. He remembered the fierce anger, the hatred of them, as if they were animate, that had welled up in his heart as he looked at them because they had failed to do their work. "You will wish to have something that was hers, Richard," her mother said. "What would you like?" On her dressing table, there was a small looking glass in an ivory frame. He asked if he might have that and carried it away with him. She had looked into it 1,000 times. No doubt she had done her hair in it. It had reflected her, enclosed her, contained her. He could almost persuade himself that something of her must remain in it. To own it was like owning something of herself. He carried it home with him, hugging it to his side with a kind of passion. He had prized it. He prized it still as his dearest treasure. The looking glass in which her face had been reflected 1,000 times. The glass that had contained her, known her, in which something of herself he felt must linger. To handle it, look at it, into it, behind it, was like holding a mystic communion with her. It gave him an emotion that was infinitely sweet and bitter, a pain that was dissolved in joy. The glass lay now, folded in its ivory case, on the chimney shelf in front of him. That was its place. He always kept it on his chimney shelf, so that he could see it whenever he glanced round the room. He leaned back in his chair and looked at it. For a long time, his eyes remained fixed upon it. If she had married me, she wouldn't have died. My love, my care would have healed her. She could not have died. Monotonously, automatically, the phrase repeated itself over and over again in his mind, while his eyes remained fixed on the ivory case into which her looking glass was folded. It was an effect of his fatigue, no doubt, that his eyes, once directed upon an object, were slow to leave it for another, that a phrase, once pronounced in his thought, had this tendency to repeat itself over and over again. But at last, he roused himself a little, and leaning forward, put his hand out and up to take the glass from the shelf. He wished to hold it, to touch it and look into it. As he lifted it towards him, it fell open, the mirror proper being fastened to a leather back which was glued to the ivory and formed a hinge. It fell open, and his grasp had been insecure. And the jerk as it opened was enough. It slipped from his fingers and dropped with a crash upon the hearthstone. The sound went through him like a physical pain. He sank back in his chair and closed his eyes. His heart was beating as after a mighty physical exertion. He knew vaguely that a calamity had befallen him. He could vaguely imagine the splinters of shattered glass at his feet. But his physical prostration was so great as to obliterate, to neutralize emotion. He felt very cold. He felt very cold. He felt that he was being hurried along with terrible speed through darkness and cold air. There was the continuous war of rapid motion in his ears, a faint, dizzy, bewilderment in his head. He felt that he was trying to catch hold of things to stop his progress, but his hands closed upon emptiness that was trying to call out for help, but he could make no sound. On, on, on. He was being whirled through some immeasurable abyss of space. Ah, yes, he's dead. Quite, the doctor. He has been dead some hours. He must have passed away peacefully, sitting here in his chair. Poor gentleman, said the porter's wife, and a broken looking-glass beside him. Oh, it's a sure sign, a broken looking-glass.